Hello, in this video I would like to draw a stair tower as requested in the comments. I have now received the approximate dimensions. I will of course try to do this off the cuff again and simply try to incorporate some commands on how to do certain things. Before that, I would also like to ask you to kindly activate the bell on my channel to quickly see when new videos are uploaded. And of course, it is also very important for YouTube to have many subscribers. That's why I would ask you to diligently activate the bell. So, what do I want to try in the video? There have been repeated requests to show the structuring a bit. 2001, how to structure it correctly, how to build it up. And now I would like to show this a bit more, maybe even a bit more intensively, so that you can better see what you can do with it and how you can build it. So let's just get started. Basically, I'll just start with a foundation. That means I would simply start here with a standard part. I can simply assign the values to this rule part here. 500, that will fit better, and I will give it a name right away. And with the A key, I can place it, for example, at the absolute 0 point. So that means I have my first part here. I can of course move it right away with the right mouse button. And I want to add another 150 here, which means the floor structure will be 150 millimeters. This means the first cuboid is basically positioned correctly. Of course, I have the option here to use the right mouse button to create new assemblies for structuring or to do this in the empty construction. What is also important, and what I always want to emphasize, is adjusting this so-called user interface. That means I can, for example, search through my commands here. For instance, I want to start a new assembly with a keyboard shortcut. That means I want to use the B key here, for example. Here it already shows me. This also cannot work for me because I have assigned the B key with a macro. For me, the B key macro is a new assembly. I would like to show that right away. That means if I simply press the B key here, I have a new assembly. And I just want to consolidate everything on site or concrete here to work in a more structured way. So that means I simply dragged and dropped this in. So the approximate dimensions are about 3 by 3 meters and the height should be around 6 meters. That means I simply copy this in that direction. But now I also want to use a different command, which might be, yes, maybe a bit exaggerated, but so that you can still see it. This parametric repetition, where I say, I want to take a linear pattern, here, in this direction. You can already see the preview here. How do I want it? I want a repetition, and it should be at 3 meters. For me, it is also important to show various commands in the videos. What can I do with them? There are of course various options here. For example, something that should not be underestimated is the reference with the maximum individual distance, like divisions of 2001, which is very important for bars and everything else. So, I could of course also create another pattern in this direction here, where I also make a copy with 3 menus. You can see the preview right away. Of course, I could also say, for example, I have an omission here that, for example, should also be removed. And of course, you can remove this again here. Importantly, here I can create a feature, and with OK I have created my 4 foundations. The big difference here compared to the other copy functions is that now there is a feature on the parent part that I could change at any time, but I don't want to because it suits me anyway. So, since I'm at it, I'll also assign these parts of material right away, so I don't forget it later. Betung proven. So, that means I have my foundations here. So, what do I have here? That means I want to make a stair tower here. That means I basically have another assembly where I will place my stable construction. That means the structuring actually follows the way I know the parts. In the steel construction, I will now first install my posts. That means I will of course need my posts again. I still want to cancel now so that it is not forgotten. Of course, I could also copy this structure at any time with the left mouse button. So, copy. That means here I want to copy it, leave it here, and have another copy, this function or this structural assembly, where my posts will go in. So I will also definitely need stairs right away. So everything I know right now, if I have posts and I have stairs, I know this from the ground up. So I will now place this onto my editing layer, and I want to immediately install a beam, which I will select from my library. So eProfiles, I will just take the HRA 200. Of course, I can change this at any time, where I then create it vertically on the editing plane with a certain length. So that means I will simply place this one here, this one here, on top. So I could again work with this by saying, for example, the bottom axis. But as I said, for me, it is always important that people get the parts to where they need to go. So that means I will naturally pull this right in and can of course work with the copy functions, move functions, and everything else. That means I will simply move this beam into, or I go into the top view and move the beam to the correct position. That means I use this D move a lot over 2 lines, from edge to edge. That would be 95 now, and I want to add another 50 meter mirrors. That means I have 50 meters here in this distance, so you can see the control. For example, I also want to dimension this right here. As you can see, the dimension was relatively small again. That means I will simply set the main scale larger to 20. Of course, I can also continue to copy the parts. That means I have the option here to use the normal construction functions for copying. So, 2 copies. That means I want to copy it everywhere. And if, for example, you find this point, here quite simple but not so easy to locate, then I always have the option to zoom in on this area with the magnifying glass, using the F key to potentially find this point more easily. As I said, if I stay out here, I naturally find it easier. But again, just to show simple commands, 2001. So that means I have my 4 posts here. I won't switch to the top view again because I'm standing behind them. I just want to move them. Click on the first post, press the control key, then the second post, and move these 2 back by a distance of 50 meter. To explain, I have this edge because I selected this profile. This edge selected to this edge would now be 260 millimeters. If I were to press enter now, this edge would be exactly flush with that one. But if I now enter 50 there, it goes 260 forward and then 50 back again. So, in other words, 210 will be the displacement, and I have it in the right place. So, now I basically have my post as a boundary and can now basically start with my staircase. The staircase will of course be placed on the active coordinate system. In principle, it doesn't matter now whether I use the world coordinate system or leave the active coordinate system. I go into the construction functions and enter the stair configurator. So I now have the option to go through a sketch, which I don't have at the moment, or without a stair hole. That means I press the middle mouse button and enter the stair configurator. So here I have the options to enter my values, meaning to input the floor structure that I know, the height of the staircase, which means I will just set it to 1600 for the staircase. When I click on it, you can see that certain values, for example, do not fit here. The step size is larger, and I can simply say that it should recalculate and adjust to my value. Of course, we also have the options to select the stringers here. Which stringers do I want? A U-shaped profile. Here, I could also go to 0.0. Now, an error message would appear during installation, but you can simply ignore it if you don't need it. But I will stick with my standard profile. Should the landings? Should a U be created? Yes or no? If I want to create a connection here at the support profile, I will do that manually, which means I will leave it. Which steps do I want to have? That means I can, of course, add my steps here and also add new steps. That means I simply select this step and want to have a screw assignment. Basically, I'm saying here, okay, I can always get back into the dialog at any time. So that means I now see the preview of the staircase, and I could say, for example, this point should come here as an example. So let's switch back to the top view. Of course, I could also work with the different views, which might not be so useful for me at the moment, because I can simply make faster progress with these top views. So that means I can now see where I have placed my staircase and can now position it accordingly. I want to have a specific measurement from here to here, for example, just so that you can see the control. I just want it to be a nice measurement here. Let's just say 1200. So I want to move it by 30 millimeters now. That means I click here with the left mouse button once to the right, twice to the right. I am at the segment and now at the staircase and can move it. That means I don't necessarily have to always go into the ICN, which of course becomes more difficult the more parts you have in there. That means I simply say here that I want a distance of 1150 millimeter. Of course, I would like to do the same again here, which means I want to have 50 millimeter from here to here. This means you can see that it is always basically the same functions. What is still simple now is that I have not paid any attention to the height at all, which I still like to do in this case because I need it repeatedly. I simply create a standard part here. For example, simply has a height of 0.1 millimeters, and let's just say it is 3000 by 3000, and this is simply the level. For example, so this should be set to absolute right away. Now I need to be careful. This already happened to me yesterday, or the day before in the video. This, of course, applies to the active coordinate system, which means I need to make sure that I am in the world coordinate system. So I have simply created a level for my M section here. I can now make it a bit larger, 23,500. It doesn't matter anyway. Of course, I pull this level back into my kit. Here, I naturally have the option to switch it back or make it transparent. That means I want to see it transparently, just to have a bit of a reference here. And I'll still copy it to my 1000 height so that I have my MRIS right away. Of course, you can still use other colors here. So let's say the surface color should simply be red. So that means I would already have a bit of an easy connection to it here. So that means I go into the side view, see of course where I am currently, and actually need to bring this staircase to the correct height. That means actually the correct height is there. And there are so many ways to do it. One way would be to simply just push it down and then, for example, to push this value up. That means now I am actually at the correct height with my staircase. You can do everything in one step, in 2 steps. So there are many ways to do it. But for me that's rather secondary now because I actually just want to show the way I could build this. So, of course, I will also save at some point. This means that, in principle, I can always go back into this staircase, which I just drag in here correctly, and I can also change the values, the difference, the tread of the intersection, values, heights, whatever, and I can change this at any time. It is important to note that it currently only applies to one run. This means that if, as in this case, the staircase continues, I essentially need to copy this staircase upwards. In other words, I simply copy it upwards, just like that. For example, go back into the configurator and simply change this one here. So the type of the staircase with OK. If this tread changes again, it will be recalculated. And I will immediately have my new staircase. Of course, I will easily bring it to the correct height in this case, from here to here. Indeed, simply naturally. Yes, the points must of course be correct. 1000. And of course, there are many ways to do this. Everyone gets used to their own way of working a bit. And then I need it rotated 180 degrees. Also, it needs to be moved. Just moved it 150, that's still not enough. What I am actually going to do now in the top view, just to define it simply, that means I want to do the same thing here. Here I have the 50 millimeter and I will do the same here as well. So, and 50, like this. Now I have simply brought this staircase to the right place. Of course, you can work here again with the tread, exit, whatever, by shifting where I say, okay, from this point to this point, I need some value, the 1150, which now actually fits on both sides, and have created this staircase here. I imagine it visually, it just goes in here quite normally. So now I have more things here that I just need to create manually. That means I can, for example, place my plane here and say I want to adopt this profile, and it should go from here. So wait a moment, that's obviously the wrong function. I need to go through the sketcher from here to here. I'm just roughly fitting it in. The position is basically already correct. I can now say top left, like this, and have, for example, immediately integrated my profile here. So this profile must of course also be taken into account how it comes from the structure, how it is connected, and how the setup is. Basically, I can just say here, okay, I want to work with these construction functions. I want to connect this U to the beam, this to that, which means it will also be extended for me. I can set the values as we have seen in the last videos. That means I don't know what is set from the last video. So this might sound a bit silly, but I will just show here. As I have already mentioned, I want to show how I can also incorporate other profiles here. That means I simply go here and could, for example, switch to a HIA, which might not be very purposeful right now, but just so you can see it. And of course, one could also, for example, adjust the position in the top view and copy it to the right in the position according to the view, aligning it on an axis. That means I go here. With H, I can create guidelines where I say, okay, this should come to the center here. And I set the plumb line here. That means I would have brought this beam to the center and could, for example, say, okay, this connection should now also be updated with the values. You can also immediately see the other connection here. Whether it is effective or not, we will leave that open to discussion. It might not visually match at all now, but I don't care at all. For me, it's only about the functions. So, what do I need to pay attention to now? That means for me, I will just connect this here, which means I will choose the next connection. This means that this profile should be connected here. That cannot be installed. Okay, then we'll just do it completely manually. Now, that means I will cut this beam here. Of course, it can be done normally here, as it has been asked for, also for this, for the screwings. That's why it might also be fitting in 2001, how I get this screwing from one profile to another. So, and I will simply put this here, a second time as well. That means now comes a crucial point that has been asked repeatedly. Actually, I mistakenly have this rear plate with this plate here, but this should come to this plate, to this beam. That means I simply need to change the structure here. I can simply cut out here, for example, then select the assembly, and here I say, for example, insert. Logically, that also belongs to mine, to my uprights. That means I will set it up correctly right away and would have, for example, the right structure ready here. So once again, why I am still doing this manually, because it was also asked, how can I transfer a screwing from one to another without always redoing it? I just noticed the grating is bothering me a bit. That means when I go to the grating, I also have the option to change it here. That means it should just go up to here, and I have simply modified it. Normally in the graphic, it might be too little now. That means I go back here, right click and simply say, okay, the point should come here, so far. And then I also have the air here. So that means this is important. So I will just cut the profile here at this edge. Wait, cutting the wrong edge at the edge. So this edge is the one I wanted, of course. So right away 10. So that means I can always come with the manual as well. I need 2. So that means I cut out this, and this plate, which should belong to this assembly. And thus I can also display the active part here just to check how this assembly looks now to also perform the inspection. Well, I always do it immediately, because if I don't do it right away, then I know myself, I would definitely forget it. So now there is basically this screwing dialog where I can say, okay, I have a screwing here. The screwing should be represented exactly. The clamping length should be calculated, and the processing plane should be confirmed with OK. Then I set the plane. I want to have my plane here, and I select my screwing here. Like this, for example. And yes, indeed, leave this screwing, definitely. I want to screw this plate to the other plate with a mouse click, then continue. Now I have a screw here. I would like to make it vertical, so let's just use 2 screws. That means I want to have 1 in the Y direction and 2 in the X direction. So of course I also have the option to define the insertion point here. So it's not always that easy, to be completely honest. As you can clearly see, I find it very, very difficult indeed myself. So I want to have the screwing 50 mm from top to bottom. That means I now press relative, i.e. R enter. Now HiCAD asks me for a reference point. I say, for example, this point, and it should be at 50, because the axis points upwards, which means 50, and the other values remain in the correct position. Basically, I can say here, for example, standard and dimension. If I want to add a washer 2001 here, that means changing the dimension and the screwing, everything possible. I could now also change the position and grid. That means I could now change the value, but I also have the right mouse button here, meaning I could also say to flip it. That means again I go to the screw, say here position and grid, right click, and here I have the option to reverse the screwing. This is also always asked. So that means I can still check where the screwing belongs. I will now carefully and securely attach and secure this to the rear beam. That means I say cut, select the rear beam and insert it. Structurally, it only has an impact for me now for copying. I have saved it again now. This is what I want to have now. I would like to simply copy this screwing. And that was also a question that was asked of me. How can I copy these screwings? 2001. What are the simple options? I just say right click here, select it. I need to use the upper function here. That means I simply say copy here, select a base point, and then just copy it further here. So, and also here. So just by copying, it is such that this screwing you can see it also on the parts. The screwing is there, meaning they are correctly recorded in the bill of materials, but these screws have not provided the sheets with any holes. That means I can easily check this here. I can say, show me the assigned parts, and there are 0 assigned parts. I would also have the option to request a parts check for the screwing itself. I will just do it. And he says, for example, that here. In this case, someone has created a part. I can say, only display the active part, which screws have no assignment here. I don't know why they don't have any, but my main concern is actually about them. That means I want to assign them automatically now. So that means he assigned 3 to me. You can also immediately see here that these screwings are now assigned to these parts. To check again, the assigned parts, and he says, okay, these 2 parts are assigned, and thus one can then relatively easily copy the screwing further in other respects. So this grating is still bothering me. That means I will bring up a glass view again and say here, this should be moved for me. This point should align with that point. That means I will immediately have the next grating here in the correct size. So the same thing would basically be done here as well. That means I would basically just simply lay a plane here, select my profile, and build it here. And now would also have the possibility to swap the ends so that it lies on the correct level or is correctly represented. And now I would basically just have to think about how I want to make this cheek there, for example. That means currently this cheek is being produced like this. I would now like to simply show if I assign this U profile to this cheek, that means I have also gotten very used to it. That means I open it up, have this beam here, and know, okay, I could pull it over here. Why? What have I done now? I want to make this beam into one, so weld it together. Let's just say the miter, for example. And this should now basically be done just like that. Of course, what I haven't paid attention to yet is that I would need a measurement here, which means this will be a bit too little for me. Of course, I can also move it by 1 or 50 at any time, for example. Also, recalculate for these beams as well. You can also see here that I actually do relatively little with the configurator in further respects, because these are all individual things that I just have to say I need to install here. Zach, wrong. Connection here, buddy. So that was the flange connection, but I can create a flange here. For example, for instance, this should be done with a flange here. So I'll just go to the preview to see what is set now. Yes, basically I say, okay, I don't need it on both sides, of course. I only want the tab on the left. And with OK, I'll just leave these values as they are set here. So you can see I can work relatively easily on an individual basis here. For example, what happens if I create this grating? Then I usually do it like this. First, I say the grating should come here, and in the second step, for example, it should be reduced by 5 millimeters at this length. This means I have immediately brought it to the correct size. So then, the next step, which is actually pretty much the last step, would be to set up the railing, basically 2001. How would I do that now? I will now play around with the terrain a bit. That means I will simply create the terrain in the first step, where I say, okay, it should start here and continue here. In this case, I still say that it continues here, then continues there, and then continues here. And basically, what we will still try it there. I don't know myself what I will get out of it. So That means the railing configurator is now being started. The offset is generally set. It will be, I will set it to 0 here, which means centered from all profiles. If I want to have it like this, for example, at different intervals, then I basically have to do them individually. I would have to select them individually. That means I will still leave the offset. Now, I will take a look at the post distribution. That means, in the end, I can of course specify a point. I don't know it right now, for example, but I can also work with values here. That means in the end, for example, it should be 1 minotaurs, which he, for example, does not allow here. So 1000, you can see here, for example, where I would be. I also have a gap here at the transition. That means I can relatively quickly play around with my values here, so to speak. Can I get down to a meter there? I will get down if I set a transition post, so it looks a bit better. So you can naturally define the maximum distance here. I also have the option to individually move the posts. This means I don't always have to have everything the same and can reach the goal relatively quickly. In the beginning, I will still decide which post I want. That means I simply take a round tube, which handrail. I will now place the filling on the knee rails anyway, simply because it is faster for the first time. I don't want any baseboards. The post substructure fits anyway. I want to be set up on top. The post handrail should connect with the pin and handrail. We don't need an upright. I'll just say okay. And here, I basically have my first railing after the calculation. That means, of course, it takes a bit of time. So that means HiCAD has now set up this railing for me here. You can naturally see the transition posts which are created here like this, and I can naturally do this here or respectively. Do I have to do this naturally through this railing configurator, or do I just need to change it here? 2001. That means I still want to remove a transition post here in the post distribution. So we have it, and even though we possess it, we don't want it at all. It's something we have, but we really don't desire it. That means at some point here we would need to have 100. Now that we have it at some point. So in principle, I have to be quite honest, I wouldn't have taken this edge, this profile here. I would have really built it individually. I have to be quite honest. What is unfortunately not possible now, I cannot remove it from the selection. Unfortunately, it just doesn't work. But in principle, what I would do is simply delete the railing in this case and just, as you say, leave out this profile. Let the calculation run. So this means that in principle, this upright would actually be unnecessary. So in this case, as it is now, I would really delete it again. But it is generally also important to know, or good to know, that you simply cannot remove this from the selection. Of course, I can delete the post here at any time, but especially at the very beginning, it often happens that I have to say, I still have many thousand changes to make, and I don't want to delete anything yet. If I delete a part, then the railing is simply broken. As soon as a part is deleted, it is broken. I have saved one favorite here, which means I want to delete this railing again. Should we just delete it and leave out the last one? That means I will simply create it again from scratch, especially in this case, so that it looks nice. That means I can't get in there anymore. I have to change the value in the post distribution beforehand, save the favorite, overwrite it and cancel. The question is, by cancelling, it might be that the dialog is not saved. Yes, it is not. I have to install it once. Actually, the last values remain in the dialog, so I will just temporarily install it so that it stays in the dialog. And now I can also get the other values. Unfortunately, this happens, but at least you can see that it is live. The last settings are there, and thus I have basically built the railing here. Of course, there are many things to change repeatedly. So I have my railing here, and in the middle it would be the same to put it in. That means, in principle, with a few commands, how would you make the connections, the extensions? Yes, that would be a point on how to create something like this with different commands. Of course, there are possibilities to use the commands in all directions. As I have read in the comments, there are so many commands that can be used here. I would like to thank you again for the feedback and would be happy to have many subscribers. So please don't forget to add the bell. Thank you.